Excited about this discussion because it's still going. Thank you guys so much. Totally awesome discussion, and now we are going to go on to the next with another rockstar group of folks who are going to be discussing principles of international elections. Again, let me introduce the moderator. So Patrick Merloe at the end is Director of Electoral Programs and Senior Associate at the National Democratic Institute. Thanks very much, Patrick.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the last panel because not only were they the most awesome collection of people who we all try to hear from put into one place, but while they were serious in what they did, they managed to make everybody in the audience laugh at least once, and I think a few times. So you may judge us and the crowd may speak upon whether we're able to get any levity into this whatsoever. And talking about space, which is what we like to do in these kinds of settings, I think what we should think about is the last panel talked about the United States and, in a sense, inner space. And what we're supposed to do is to give a bridge into the international arena. So in some ways, you should think about us as blasting off into outer space. And in that sense, it may be useful to use the metaphor of that shot of the Earth looking back from the moon, because we're asked to talk about principles in approaching elections internationally. And to that, you need that kind of global perspective. The first principle to think about is we're here to talk about tech and elections. But in reality, we're not talking about technology and we're not talking about elections. What we're talking about is democracy. And there are a lot of ways to peel that onion and to look at what democracy is. But the essence of it, I don't know how many of you, raise your hands, have just recently seen the movie Lincoln. And if you think about the beginning, we all unfortunately know the end of that movie, whether we've seen it or not. But the beginning of that movie are soldiers reciting from memory back to President Lincoln the Gettysburg Address. And one of the things about the Gettysburg Address is it's the first time that the phrase was used of the people, by the people, and for the people. A definition of democracy that I think we all have come to understand. And if you buy into that, if you take as your premise, looking at this subject matter, that sovereignty, if you're going to organize yourself into states, sovereignty resides in the people. And the authority to govern flows from that. It flows from the expression and the will of those people. And there's only one way to get to that, and that's through an election. There are a lot of ways to organize an election, but you have to have an election to be able to get at that subject matter. So I would start with the first principle, and that is elections belong to the people. If we keep that in mind, all of our discussions about various uses of technology or various other challenges in the elections makes more sense. The second point that I would make, and only three before we go to hear from the panelists, and that is there are a lot of principles in looking at elections. In fact, this process of internationalizing what democracy means or what elections mean in a democratic context goes back decades. Someone, I think Chad's going to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it's a process that's been underway for a very long time, and in fact, this process has changed the behavior of many governments, particularly pushed forward after the Cold War and the kinds of democratic transitions that have taken place in every continent around the world except two, and that's Australia, which already had democracy, and Antarctica, where the penguins haven't yet gotten it. So if you think about the global aspect of democratization, the change of behavior of governments because of commitments and expectations, there's also been a significant change in the way those people who compete for government office have acted. And most significantly, in my opinion at least, there's been a fundamental shift in the way citizens engage in elections and democratic processes in governance. And that's really what we're going to try to get at here. 3 points to keep in mind. Inclusiveness. Robin Carnahan started us off with that. It really is about universal and equal suffrage, and with that, you don't have it without building public trust. To have public trust, as Robin said, you have to have transparency. So there are a number of ways to get at transparency, and technology both can help us get at it and in other ways can create challenges to getting at it. And the third, which we haven't talked much about, is accountability. Elections are an accountability mechanism, but you don't trust elections. You don't get at public confidence unless there are accountability of the actors in the elections and unless there are remedies for the elections. Because if you don't feel that you can overcome fraud or prevent fraud, then why would you participate in the first place? And that takes me to my last point and sort of principles about elections. Elections don't only allow people to express their will about who should have the authority to govern. They also should resolve peacefully the competition for political power. And in the places where we work around the world, that is a real and serious challenge, whether you're emerging from a history of civil war and conflict, or whether you're in a country where confidence in the election results have been crushed, and you end up like Kenya in 2007, where between 1,000 and 1,500 people died and hundreds of thousands displaced, some of whom even today, or whether you're in a situation where the elections even were deemed for the first time since the transition in military rule in Nigeria to be something that was credible. Nonetheless, hundreds of people died in northern Nigeria based around a deeper conflict and basis for conflict that's ethnic and religious based. All of that has to be part of what we think about in a global perspective when we come at the principles for elections. And so our panelists today will touch on each of these subjects in their various ways from a wealth of experience. You all have seen their bios in the materials that were handed out, and those who are watching online, it's on the website. I won't go into them, but the first person we're going to hear from is Catie Lott from USAID, who has served in many of these places, and before that was a journalist. So she has a unique perspective. Catie.
I think I will, stand up here. I guess, I don't even think I need a microphone. I actually have a very loud voice. Let the record show that technology.
Ooh, they're live streaming.
Okay, live streaming, so I do need to use the microphone. Okay. So I will stand behind here. Let the record show that I love technology, that technology is my friend. But I want to introduce a kind of a dose of realism into our world overseas in the numerous countries I've served in. So I'm going to talk about technology, but I also am going to kind of link it with the things that I worry about. So next slide. Am I able to do this myself? Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to start with a story. I was just in an African country recently, and a friend was involved in an accident on his bike. A truck hit him. So he asked me to go to the police station with him. Now, this police station is across from the U.S. Embassy, across from the United Nations. As far as African police stations go, it's the luxury police station. So we walk in. The first thing you see on this wall are all the used car spare parts and tires. On this side of the wall, you see all the plastic shields that they use for violence if they're called out, crowd control. We sit down at a table, and the officer in charge starts rifling through files and desks and folders, and finally he pulls out something. He comes over, sits down at the table, and he's like, "Okay, I found a piece of paper. Let's get started." And then he starts doing this. And now he can't find his pen. And so he gets up and starts looking again. On the other side of town, the U.S. government, as well as other international donors, they're spending millions of dollars on USAID-like NGOs that are crowdsourcing, that are mapping potential for violence in the next election, that are collating data. They're using, all the modern kind of technology available to them, and then predicting where violence is going to occur. And then the answer is, okay, you've done all this wonderful work using the latest technology, and then you pick up the phone and call who? The police officer who's still looking for his pen? And so my fear is that the international community is creating this very unequal formula where the demand side is using all the latest available technology while the response side is completely unprepared. Next slide, let's see. Okay, even this I can't, so I've got, okay, there we go. Where's the money? I want to, something else that really keeps me awake is a couple of things here. Mobile money, I think to this crowd probably most people are familiar with that term. What we're seeing, really quick story, I was with my colleague up in the northern reaches of Kenya. Mobile money sweeping the country. We're driving down to Nairobi. He says, "I need to stop." He's looking at his phone. He stops alongside the road, hops out, goes up to this shack that's held together with 2 nails, comes back in the car a minute later. I said, "Is everything okay?" He says to me, "Granny just SMS'd me. She needs money." And so his grandmother, way up in the Northern Rift, is able to send him an SMS. And so money is moving across East Africa like this. I mean, you can pay bills, you can pay debts, you can do everything. You can also buy votes. And so suddenly, the whole issue of vote buying, corruption, campaign finance, drug money is gone under the table. As international donors before, it was actually quite easy. You could see outside the polling station money being handed out, being exchanged. But now with this new technology, for all its wonder that it brings, it's also put this huge wrinkle into campaign finance and vote buying. The other issue I am concerned about is the sustainability of the systems. I mean, biometric voter registration. Who doesn't like it? How cool is that? You step up there, you put your fingerprints, your face comes up. It is great technology, but it comes at a cost. And so in many of the countries we work in, that's money that is taken away from health budgets, from education budgets. The international community is strong-armed into supporting these systems. And I'm not saying that they're not worthwhile or useful, but they come, as I say, at a cost. And while, for example, in Nigeria, there are 100,000 biometric kits sitting there that they are willing to loan for free, part of the issue is the suspicion if they're sitting in Nigeria, right? You open up the computer and you're going to get some kind of scam, banking scam, send money to this account. There's a lack of trust. But we could easily see, why isn't the international community pushing the AU to hold a data banks professionally maintained, under conditions? Because part of the problem, too, is you make these big commodity dumps into technology. 4 years, 5 years later, you go back. Does it even work? Can you find it? And you may have to repeat once again another big commodity dump. So again, the systems we're setting up, are they sustainable? And at what cost? Quickly moving along, PVT, parallel vote tabulation. Essentially, this is a parallel vote that takes place. A PVT, an exit poll, maybe you're more familiar with that term as well. The idea is that you are doing a very small statistical sample with strict protocols to come up with another vote, right? To see how it matches. If you do a PVT very well, it can be wonderful. It can help reinforce what the government officially publishes. It can challenge. It shows the government that somebody's watching. A bad PVT is your worst nightmare. I know personally. So my point here, what keeps me awake, the technology is there. It's very affordable. But do organizations have the capacity, and should you use it? Not everybody needs a PVT, despite what most ambassadors push for. They like to see PVTs, and I'm going to quickly wind up here. My last point that keeps me awake at night, the digital divide that we see in developing countries. Women, whether you're a candidate or a woman voter, you don't have access to the same level of technology. As a voter, many women in rural areas have never touched a computer in their lives. Not really sure what to make of the technology. And the women candidates, they do not have access to the same media. They do not have the same technological capacity and sophistication. And so I think as the international community, I really worry that, are we in our programming addressing that? Are we voter education as well as support for women candidates that really try to bridge that divide rather than exacerbate it? My last slide. So I love technology, but it's not a replacement for trust, as Pat alluded to. If you have a government or a process that you don't trust on paper, it doesn't make it any better if it's not on paper, if it's, a paperless election or a biometric. The last point, too, technology is not a replacement for capacity. If you've got a bad electoral body with bad processes, it doesn't matter if it's paperless or on paper. It's a bad process. So while technology can fix things, I think we have to be very cognizant about what it can't fix. Thank you.
Thanks, Catie. To clear the screen for Chad. Chad Vickery is from the International Foundation for Election Systems, and Chad has been in many places around the world and has accepted the challenge to talk about the principles.
Yes. And I'm supposed to do this in between 5 and 8 minutes, so yeah, bear with me. I think, as Pat alluded to earlier, I think the foundational documents and international public law documents we look at, there are many of them. And so hopefully I can just give you an overview of a couple of major articles that you would have to look at when you're looking at principles. And then you're looking at case law, best practices, a whole slew of information that administrators, observers, and others look at. And the UN Declaration for Human Rights, Article 21, obviously is a foundational article which that points to elections. I won't go through and read that. What I'm going to try to do is look specifically at the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, Article 25, and I'm going to go through and unpack that a little bit just to illustrate to you in a way an administrator looks at this law and how it impacts their processes and also how election can play a role in that. But I want to also just quickly highlight a couple of other documents that I think are very influential right now. I'll talk about one. It's the Covenant on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and Article 29 in particular, in which gives people with disabilities and intellectual disabilities specifically the same rights as anybody else to vote. And that too, through administration, has lots of implications and technology. In the United States, there's a lot of technology that's used to help people with disabilities vote, and I think that that is also becoming a trend internationally, but it has to be sustainable and it has to be affordable. But when I look at Article 25 and I look at some of the specific phrases that are in the document, one thing that it asks for, it's not on this slide, is a genuine elections. What does genuine elections mean for an administrator? I think what we've talked about largely is building trust and transparency. And I think the losing party needs to accept the results as a huge indicator of if there's trust in the process. And one way that administration and technology can interpret that is, for example, if a precinct level election commission puts the results, if there are observers that watch a count, those counts are signed off by everybody in the room, they're posted on the precinct, and then those results are aggregated and traced all the way back up to the central count, and somebody can see the results. That's going to give a lot of people a lot of ways to verify the count. It's going to help with trust. Well, sometimes there's security issues and other things in which you can't do that. Sometimes the law or the framework isn't there that allows you to do that. But it is something that with SMS technology and other ways, the technology can help trace those votes and include and increase transparency. For example, and that's some of this is derived directly out of these international public law documents. Another example is universal and equal suffrage, which is called for in ICCPR 25. And of course, the first step in gaining access to the elections in many places is to be on the voter registry. And technology is a huge point for technology in elections from the election administration part is a database that manages the voter registry. It's a huge process. You're comparing data with civil registries, you may be doing door-to-door enumeration, there's many ways in which you collect data, the way you process data, and a lot of this, of course, the purpose and the reason why we're doing this is the international principle of genuine and periodic elections, that people have access to vote. Again, the CRPD requires people to have this right. And so the voter registry needs to make sure that they're reaching out to making gender focus, disability focus, in addition to other minority communities to make sure they have access to the voter registry. Do you have provisional ballots like we do in the United States? Many other issues. Secrecy of the ballot. I think this is one in which technology definitely has an impact and can be difficult. For example, in the District of Columbia, we had 400 folks from around the world come to observe the U.S. election process. And we go to Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. to observe the elections. Well, here, as you know, you can either go to the DRE, the electronic voting machine, or you can do an optical scan ballot. Well, in the district, when you fill out the optical scan ballot, you fill it out in secret, but then you go to the counting, the ballot box, which has the scanner counter on top of it. You take it out and you feed it through the machine, and everybody who's standing around can see how you voted. That might not, in the district, that might not be a big issue, but in the Philippines, this is exactly the same thing that happened. And if a political party observer is standing there, or an accredited observer who may not be ethical, is watching who's voting, can see how they voted, you could pay for votes, there's corruption, there's all sorts of other issues. So secrecy of the ballot is a very specific thing. This person needs to go through this process and maintain secrecy throughout. Sometimes technology helps it, sometimes it hurts it. And then I also want to say that in the Maldives, they have a situation which is really strange, in which you can go and vote in any precinct you want. And the election commission is supposed to get a ballot there. And if you're the only voter in a precinct, not only can you vote in that precinct, but they also have to post the results at the precinct level. So if you're the only person who voted, your results are posted on the precinct outside. So this is a law in which needs to be changed to reflect international principles to protect secrecy of the ballot. Next thing is guaranteeing the free expression and the will of the voters. This is obviously a big issue for all of us. For academics and for people who work in election administration, there's a lot of issues surrounding this, obviously, and again, it's building trust in the process. But when fraud is brought into the process, obviously, guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the voter has been changed. I want to say that it's interesting that a lot of people use the word in our world as malpractice as fraud. And I think we really need to make a distinction, and there's a reason to make a distinction. There's lots of different ways a system can be influenced. Some of it's intentional, some of it is not. If there's systemic manipulation, the laws are written in a way in which the parties are taking advantage of it. And it's clear and open to everyone. It may be thresholds to gaining access to the ballot, or it could be in many, many different ways which the law is specifically favoring a party. Now, that's not fraud and that's not manipulation. I mean, it's not a malpractice because it's in the law. Observers and others can try to get the law changed to fix it, but on election day, the election commission or the election management body, there's nothing they can do to change the systemic manipulation that's written into the law. That's more of a legislature, an oversight function. Many times academics call this malpractice. Malpractice itself is when somebody has committed negligence. If a poll worker is not putting indelible ink on a finger properly to ensure that they're not voting multiple times, is that fraud or is it malpractice? Is it because they were poorly trained? Is it because there's something wrong with the ink? There's a million different things. The poll worker themselves may not have a duty to fix that problem. But we call that fraud in many places, where fraud is actually the intentional act to try to change the outcome of the election, to take away guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the voter. This is an intentional act. It's a criminal act. Now, why does this matter? It matters because when we had built programs to address it, if it's malpractice, maybe we train the poll workers. Maybe there's voter education. There's a lot of different ways to deal with that. If it's fraud, we criminally prosecute people and hold them accountable. This is an issue that I think around the world we need to think of the distinctions so that when we're designing programs that we're making them the most effective. Now, of course, if there is fraud that's been entered into the process, people need to have the right to address the problem. There needs to be a remedy to the issue. And we have researched and published a book called The Guidelines for Understanding, Adjudicating, Resolving Disputes in Elections, GARD, it's called. Through a lot of research of international public law documents, through case law, through best practices, we've identified 7 minimal standards that, if adhered to, gives people a definite ability to remedy fraud if it happens or malpractice if it happens in the process. I won't go through all of them. The book is online if you want to see it. The thing that's interesting about the first chapter of this book is it highlights all of the different sources of international public law principles that apply to elections, in which if you look at it, you could see how they apply. And as you could see, it's just giving somebody the right of redress. It's making sure that the standards are clear for everyone who's involved in the process and they understand it before the election, not after, that there has to be an informed and impartial arbiter, that there has to be expedited decisions. However, due process has to be protected. And I think this is a lot of tension, is resolving disputes quickly in elections because you have to, but respecting due process rights. Establish burdens of proof. Who has to prove that there's been the fraud? What are the standards of evidence that many times, for example, in the Philippines, somebody can be held accountable, can be charged with fraud. The litigation will go on while they sit on their seat. It will not be remedied by the time their term is over in office. That's not an effective remedy. And then lastly, it's effective education of stakeholders. Everybody involved needs to understand the principles that apply to the process. They need to understand what their rights and ability to challenge if there's been a wrong committed. That has to be a voter education effort that everybody needs to take place in. So I'm sorry for how quickly I went through that, but I wanted to get through it as fast as possible. And as I said, there's a lot of resources online in which you can look at these principles as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Chad. This is a very highly condensed law school course with a very practical, bent to it. And thank you for doing that. Alex Sutton is with the International Republican Institute, which also works around the world to promote democratic principles and developing of institutions. And Alex's role in voter education and other activities is something that brings real strength to the conversation. Alex?
Thanks, Pat. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to the hosts of this conference for inviting us. I think this is a great opportunity for you all over the next couple of days to hear some of the discussion that's mixing elections with technology. Obviously, this is something that, no matter where we're working, it is creeping into our missions. Over the next couple of days, or today at least, you're going to hear a lot of breakouts and a lot of comments, and you already have about how technology is impacting things and where it fits into elections. What I thought I would do is, at America, and as we work through elections and think about the use of technology, we sometimes take a step back and ask ourselves some very basic questions. And I thought these might be interesting to you, just as you sort of listen the rest of the day and then go into your breakouts and then to tomorrow. The first one, it's going to seem very obvious and maybe sound like a silly question, but why do we care about elections and electoral processes in the first place? And Pat got into this in his introduction. I do think it's something that we need to contemplate as we think about particular countries and particular regions, and in particular democratic equations. Should we actually be concerned about elections? Is there a systematic way to evaluate the need for electoral assistance or observation against other needs that we perceive in the democratic framework? So I think that's a really important question to ask, as you approach your countries. For the sake of the discussion in this conference, I think it's important to understand and evaluate some of these ideas in the context of the components of an electoral process. And, this is important because not all components carry the same weight depending on where you are. In some places, the literal voting process is the problem. In other places, that's not the problem, but registration is the problem. In other places, it might be neither of those, but it's the counting and tabulation process, while in others, it's everything. But I do think that, as you look at particular cases in the future with limited resources in this fiscal environment, sometimes we have to make choices, and you need to be looking at perhaps the particular components where we want to be emphasizing. Third question, historically, and I think this is a really important one, and I know that Susan has done a lot of research on this, is historically has electoral assistance and observation actually showed a meaningful return on investment? It's a really important question. I think this is actually, a real question in a lot of people's minds, depending on, where your experiences are. But again, especially now in this, this new fiscal reality that we're in, I think we do need to think about returns on investments a lot more carefully than perhaps we have in the past. And what are the real outcomes of doing something like an observation or, work to help an electoral process, and are those going to yield perhaps the same type of impact that you would see in other D&G programming? And then I think a question sort of related to that is, evaluation. I know this is sort of what a lot of us are paid to, think about a large amount of time, and I think it's important to kind of step back and say, when we're investing a lot into helping improve an electoral process or observe an election, are we applying the same sort of rigid analysis and an impact evaluation on that investment that we are perhaps other democracy and governance programs? Then the fourth, obviously, are elections becoming more free and fair because of technology, which Catie mentioned, and I totally agree with the the statement that tech doesn't replace trust. But, I think this is, something to really consider carefully because, here's the thing. For every election that we see improved by technology, we also see that there are places, and, we don't necessarily need to get into, specific countries, but where we all fear that technology is actually being used very well and very effectively to manipulate the process and unlevel the playing field. So, the question is, how do we assess that and balance out our investments? And then the fifth one, our efforts of election observers becoming more effective through technology. And, obviously we know the answer to this is going to be yes, and hopefully that will all be your assessment at the end of this conference. However, if I were in your shoes, I might be asking, are we using this technology to the best of our potential? And, as Catie alluded to, are we sometimes maybe falling into a trap of utilizing technology because it's available, but it might not actually be the best and most logical and best cost-effective tool to carry out something that we want to do. But overall, I mean, when we look at, the role that technology has played, especially on citizen observers and domestic observation, I think there's no question that through crowdsourcing and through wireless technologies and texting, we all obviously all know that things have been improved through technology. Anyways, those are 5 questions that I thought I would throw out there to evaluate.
Thank you, Alex. I think in essence, the question that you're asking is, are elections worth our energy? And it made me reflect back, when in my days as a student in civil rights related things. I'm not old enough to be an election official in Missouri, according to Robin, but I'm old enough to remember those days when I engaged. And one of the first things we came to in civil rights issues, well, I got started with police brutality and other things, was you got to deal with elections. If you can't get control of the political apparatus, then you're not going to be able to deal with these other kinds of issues. So, and the same thing for those in the audience. If there's a way that technology can help solve the problems that you're posing, then it's worth it for us together to engage in this. And I think you pose a really important question, which is now why we turn to Susan Hyde, because Susan, sitting at Yale, but also engaging overseas in many different places, has developed a really unique perspective. And so that's why I don't use sports analogies often, but that's why, in effect, we asked her to be the cleanup batter. So, Susan?
I hope I don't strike out. I think this is a really challenging audience to speak to in some ways because it's very diverse. I have a Twitter account. I think I have 6 followers. But I have a younger brother who has 35,000 who's very involved in this. And we have had many arguments about whether Twitter should be a more important part of my life if I want people to listen to things that I'm doing in my research. And so far, he's not persuaded me, but I'm reconsidering my position as a result of being at this conference. I think one of the interesting challenges that we face is that almost every country in the world today now holds national elections. So in the past decade, I think there are 5 or 6 countries in the world that did not hold a national election with direct voting for national office. This means that the challenges that we talk about in terms of the role of technology in elections are really, really diverse. And the thing that many of us have focused on are the types of governments that have no intention of giving up power if they were to lose an election. So they go through the show of holding an election. They don't think they will lose, right? They've done a lot of things to make sure that they won't lose. And I was very struck by the comments this morning from our keynote speaker about increasing public confidence in the process. What does it mean to you to try to increase public confidence in the process in a context in which you have a government that's basically holding demonstration elections for their own benefit? What if citizens shouldn't have confidence in that particular process? And in the absence of significant political reforms, and citizen awareness, I was thinking this morning, in some of these cases, awareness of what's really going on might have a huge deterrent effect on participation, because they would know that they have zero chance of influencing the process. And I think that it's really interesting to think about the role of technology in these very difficult situations. I wanted to talk about a few things that, as an academic who studies international relations and then who studied the global spread of elections, and then has served as an international observer, as I'm sure many people in this room have done, the things that sort of surprised me a little bit in the field. Sometimes, and thinking about the role of technology in elections, sometimes everything is wet and there is no power. Right? And so how do you, so that's not an unsurmountable problem, but you don't always anticipate when everything is going to be wet and there's going to be no power. You also sometimes don't anticipate exactly when cell phone coverage is going to go out. There are often no maps, and by no maps I mean really no maps. That is changing a little bit. We're getting a little bit more information. But in a jungle, even the Google area view of the country doesn't really give you many hints about where the roads might be. That said, so this I think makes appropriate design very difficult. I have been an end user for some of these I've been a short-term observer trying to use some of these technologies during an international election observation mission. And I'll say that when you're driving in, I can't remember, maybe Liberia or Afghanistan, and you're trying to enter data on a smartphone, you will often get car sick. You will often bang your head against the window, and you will probably have to slow down significantly during the course of election day to attempt to manage the issues that inevitably come up that are often unanticipated. So I think, in my experiences at least, they've been really informative and really interesting and also very exciting to get data more quickly, to have data reported more accurately, but to also think about the user experience in these situations in which, there are other things that can go wrong, but, there are a lot of things that at least haven't been thought of in the experiences that I've had. There are lots of data that I think are very basic that would be very useful to lots of people. Precinct level election results are sometimes posted by governments and then disappear. As an academic, I know I can give you a list of 150 academics who would love to have all of the data that has been published by governments and a bunch of other people. I think we often underestimate the level of knowledge when we're talking about appropriate use of technology, increasing citizen activism. In a lot of countries in the world, this is still a really small subset of the population. In a project that I've been working on in Cambodia, the population that we're serving, 25% of our population that we're serving has never heard the word National Assembly that we're targeting for a democracy promotion program, and 50% has heard the word but can't say anything about what it means. That's 75% of the population that's been voting since 1993 and doesn't know what they're voting for, right? I mean, and so introducing technology, maybe there's other priorities, but maybe technology can help deal with those things. Also considering illiteracy, lack of electricity, all of these other things. A big point I wanted to make is that, and other people have made this, but I think it's so important that it's worth emphasizing. One should not assume good intentions. Manipulation, intimidation, fraud, nefarious campaign tactics are constantly evolving and will continue to constantly evolve no matter what technological fixes work today, right? And I think that is something to keep in mind, that this is something that will need to evolve as things go over time. I think that it's important to keep in mind that leaders of a country are, to quote one of my colleagues, cruel and vicious autocrats. And it's really interesting to think of all of the ways that they might exploit data to target people for detention, persecution, abuse, and other things. And we've seen it happen already, right? So it's important to think about the unintended and very negative consequences for individuals who are making the brave step of reporting problems with their government, but then spend time in jail as a result. I think removing barriers to participation is a great idea. I think that it's also important to think of where there are significant barriers to participation and why there are significant barriers to participation. To me, there's a huge divide between governments that lack the capacity to reduce those barriers to political participation, but that would like to, and governments who are systematically disenfranchising the people who do not support them, or the people who they suspect do not support them. Reducing barriers to participation in those two different contexts are really different problems, and I'd like to see people discuss how we can basically come up with the technological innovations that are in some ways dictator-proof, that can be used even in these contexts that are very difficult, that are not going to lead to persecution of individuals who seek information on opposition candidates or who report incidents. One other side point, there's a lot of really interesting things that are going on in terms of people being able to detect fraud, manipulation, all of these things. As a cautionary tale, I would be very suspicious of anyone who says they have the singular method for detecting election fraud. There are too many methods of election fraud for any one method to pick them up. I think paying attention to all of these as they evolve is an exciting step and something that we should be aware of. Some things that work once, so some autocrats, at least as I read their electoral autocrats, can be surprised once, but only once, right? And so something that may work in one election may not work in the next election. And this is something to keep in mind in terms of the constant evolution. My intuition, just thinking about the next steps, the priorities for using technology in elections in the developing world, would be that making it easier for citizens to get information about their government it is probably an easier first step than making it easier for citizens to interact with and report and expose themselves as potential supporters of the opposition in these countries in which they may be persecuted, right? I think this is a real thing to be aware of, or that the sort of Shahidi style stuff can be manipulated in order to falsely accuse one's opponents of engaging in things that they're not in fact engaging in, to discredit them and the like. There is a declaration of principles and code of conduct for international election observers. Dozens of organizations have signed this. Many people are adhering to it now. It was signed in 2005. I thought this morning, should there be something like this in relation to the use of technology in the developing world in elections? Could we come up with some general principles that keep in mind that this should be a means toward an end, not an end in itself? Because I think that's sometimes, at least when I encounter people in the field, the confusion that happens, that we should do this just because we can. Not because it's actually helping us in any important way. I've also heard a lot of hypotheses. I'm an evidence-based person. I love to see these things pilot tested. I love to see these things tested. Keeping in mind questions of sustainability, keeping in mind questions of how these things can be used nefariously. And I'd love to have this community continue in terms of that, right? To see what do people know, what are people learning about what works and what doesn't. I think there's already been a fair number of lessons learned. I think some of the breakout panels will share those lessons, but it would be great if a lot of fascinating changes coming. So I'll stop there.
I think you can see why we put her as the cleanup person. And I'm mindful of the fact that we are at 12:30, the time that we're supposed to end. We stand between you and lunch, and we stand also between us, the morning kickoff, the real action, which will be in the breakouts this afternoon in the unconference that are there. So we'll take a few more minutes with your permission and push on a bit. But what I'm taking from the panel's conversation are a couple of points. One is the diversity of the circumstances that you have to consider when you're looking at things internationally. And so we can consider whether the digital divide is real in some country, or even if there is a digital divide, what's the penetration of mobile technologies in that country? And that helps us to look at what the proper solutions might be in those particular circumstances. I'm taken by the magnitude of the challenge. And I think Robin Carnahan, again this morning, when you talked about what it takes to organize an election, in my experience, which now is over 65 countries, 150 missions, what I have come to see is that there's nothing that a country does quite like an election, other than perhaps a military mobilization, or if you're in a place like Bangladesh, the disaster relief that takes place after the monsoons. The logistical undertaking of having tens, if not hundreds of thousands of polling stations, the need to bring to those stations certain critical materials on time, have people who are trained to receive, use, and be able to come back and honor the people's will in the millions who show up, tabulate that, is a tremendous undertaking. And in places where there's not a long history of democratic elections and therefore public trust, as we have established mostly in this country, then to be able to see into that and to know that these things are actually genuine and true is a real challenge, and that's for the political competitors and also for the citizens, because driving through all of this issue about citizen election observation. So let me just say one more thing about that came out of the comments of the panel is, I think when we look at this question of how to gather information and what to do about it, we have to look at what's the question we're asking, and then what's the proper source of the information to help us answer that question. And if the question, for example, is a general question, what's the general nature of things in a country? Is there a lot of violence in the electoral context? You can have to sort out whether violence is politically motivated or there's some other reasons behind the violence in an election. But is there a lot of violence? Well, the reporting of that by citizens don't need to be trained directly to a common source, whether that's viewed on a digital map or not, is a really interesting and important way to get at that problem, to get at that question. Is there vote buying? You can have tens of thousands of trained observers in a country, but really they're not able to get at this question of vote buying, let alone if it's done by mobile telephone now. So having citizens be able to report raw data to a location, whether that's analyzed before it's posted or whether it goes directly to a map, that's a really interesting thing. The question that you're getting at is the best source of the information are the citizens, if you will, the crowd. On the other hand, if what you're looking at is the voter registry accurate? Or even more critical, is the vote count accurate? And did the process that took place on election day have integrity to support that tabulation even if it was accurate? Was there ballot box stuffing? Were there other things going on inside the polling station? Then random reports by citizens across the country don't get the information. It's not the source that you need to answer that question. What you need is a systematic approach with trained people using rapid technologies which may end up displayed on a map or any other way that you want to visualize it to be effective. Twitter becomes tremendously important in all of this. If you're looking at the question of violence and how to mitigate violence, if there's mobile penetration and Twitter is used around the country, then doing sentiment analysis of the Twitter feeds about incitement and about violence can really help you understand what to do and how to mobilize resources to mitigate the potentials for violence in that country. So I think the solutions that we have depend upon this multiplicity of questions and how we dig into it. So let's take a couple of minutes, open up, see if there's some pressing questions, and keep in mind that we need to move on to the break. So, there's one. I see one. I see two hands. Let's go to, I think you've not asked a question previously.
Hi, my name's Carol Finn, and I'm with IAD. And my question is, has the Arab Spring created a backlash to access to the internet on a wide-scale basis? Because I spend a lot of my time trying to influence educational policymakers to provide universal access to the internet for open source learning. So that's my question.
Great. Susan, do you want to? Or Catie?
I think we don't know for sure, but I think that there was already a backlash. A lot of governments have attempted to restrict citizen access to the internet before the Arab Spring. I think anytime you have a revolution happen, you can look back a very long time and see that all of the other dictators in the region get nervous about whatever it is that just happened, right? So, you can point to the internet this time, but you can point to a lot of other things in a lot of other contexts. So I would expect that people are, yes, nervous about things spreading this way, but you also see a lot of examples of the governments using it to their own end to suppress.
I think a good source for the answer to that question is there's a consortium between the University of Toronto, Harvard, and MIT that looks at the use of internet data across the country, as many people in the audience know probably better than me. But one of the things they've discovered is that around electoral periods, and I'm sure it's also true around democratic breakthroughs or other mass movements, there has been an increase on the part of governments to try to repress that by cutting off access to mobile technologies, shutting down the towers, and so on. There have been, nonetheless, ways around that, and I think our last panel addressed some of the solutions and how you can work around that. The Arab Spring, by all means, brought much more attention to this subject. And I would say, if you look at the waves in history of these kinds of things, the breakthroughs that came about at the end of the Cold War and the mass movements of democratic transitions in Africa, Latin America, and other places took place without these technologies. But what the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening, I prefer to say, has been doing is it's had consequences in many other countries where I travel in sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia and even in Latin America. People are picking up these techniques and employing them. So not a direct answer to your question, but I hope maybe a little bit. Is there, go ahead.
Hi, Melissa Estock again from NDI, and I have a comment/question. It's that it strikes me in my experience that it's not hard to add information and voices to the pre-election and election night. And this technology is doing it more and more. So whereas we might have had, 60 observers from an international group or 600 from a domestic group or a sample of 6,000 before, now we're getting all of these different sources of information, maybe, 600,000 in a bigger country, people on Twitter or Facebook. And to me, the hard thing is the interpretation of that information. So what do you think about that? And given that in many cases, it's, you have a span of hours on election night if you're involved in making statements about a process, in what places have you seen, a responsible, quick interpretation of all of these different sources of information, particularly now with technology and the social media involved?
To repeat just for the streaming part, so the essence of the question is interpretation of information in addition to interpretation for data, particularly around the election night and whether there should be confidence in the results. What examples have you seen where there are quick and reliable information that's made available? Please, Chad, yeah.
Well, I'm going to take a different approach to that question, I think, is what's the use of the information? If there's a real question of the legitimacy of the election, what are the means in which you remedy the problem? So, as I said previously, if you're going to remedy an election problem, it's going to happen in the courts or in some sort of an arbiter. So, for me, I'm thinking, is there any way in which that information can be used as evidence, or is there anything that it can be used for to actually remedy the problem? And I would say under standards of evidence, it's not going to. In many cases. And in many countries in which we work, many times complaints are filed that are just clear full of hearsay, and they're not based on any facts that can be proved in court. So I think that you have to go back and ask the question, what's the information for? And how can you use it to remedy the problem you're dealing with? I think if it's just a way to let off steam, or is it something that's going to be a real way in which to confront a problem that's happened on election day is a question I think we need to ask in regards to how we're collecting this data and what we do with it.
Let me add to that, though. I think you're onto something. I think you're absolutely right, because we have the capability and analyze, sort it in any meaningful way, and then come up with kind of, to draw from that data. And frankly, the countries I've worked in, they are just now that they can collect it all, what do you do with it? And they're not there yet, even in kind of the more sophisticated countries, developing countries I've worked in. But even you go back to Iceland, right? They just, crowdsource their constitution, but then them, well, to quantify it. And they're just like, well, a lot of people really said this. And so kind of if you think of a sophisticated country like that and trying to take it down to Africa and Asia, I would just argue that they're not there yet, but certainly people are thinking hard about it. Now that I have crowdsourced 20,000 responses, how am I sense of this?
I have the spirit of a little debate here.
Yeah, well, just one other thing to add, and for me in Latin America, this is particularly relevant. The election day is just one very small part of this process, and I think what we find, at least in some Latin American examples, is that election day is actually going fairly well, and that folks who are running these elections, as Susan said, we might have caught them once, but they won't be caught a second time. They've gotten the process right. So what's happening is when you use the example of crowdsourcing and observers on election day, what you're finding is that folks are going down their checklists and actually saying, yeah, it didn't look that bad. But what you're missing in that, and especially, how compared to how much that might be amplified or utilized by different outlets, what happened on the other 364 days of that year is sort of de-emphasized. And, the elections aren't being stolen these days on election day. They're being stolen, every other day. So I think that's an important part of this.
Can I just say, I just want to make a slightly bolder out, something that independent academic I can be not very diplomatic, but I think, just because information exists and can be put on a map does not make it representative or accurate. And I just want to hammer that point home again and again and again, because I have been on missions that have started to do this. Like, look, we can map things. It makes it look like it's representative. Mm-hmm. It gives the misinformation out there that this is a representative look at problems on election day in this country. It is nothing of the kind. It's just what we could manage to put on a map at the time that we were able to put it up in order to get a little bit more press. And I just want to, because I can say stuff like that, I wanted to make that point, we do know something about sampling. We do know something about representativeness, and we need to continue to use those principles as we introduce technology to some of these things.
We like the fact that you stir things up. Maybe to bring this to a conclusion, I would say, for me, on election night in the United States, I'll review a little bit about election night in the United States for me this time, was looking at CNN. So take one of the networks that I watched, at CNN, and the map. And I thought to myself, I want that map. I want to be able to look and say, all right, here are the 50 states. I want to be able to see how it's trending in the states and where the vote count's going, what the percentages are as it's coming in. I want to be able to touch Virginia and then have Virginia open up and to be able to say, here's the trends in Virginia. Now let's look at this county and touch this one. 97% of the votes are in this county, and it trends towards this particular political party. Hit 5 others and show the same, and then go to another part of the state where the votes are out and there's large numbers of votes, and what's the political trend in that, and then make some hypothesis about which way this might go before you make a projection. But what I'm looking at when I see Anderson Cooper or whoever it happens to be, touching the map, what I'm seeing is a reliable network of data collection by trained people who are rapidly communicating that using all of the best technologies to a place where it's being synthesized, the credibility is being checked, and then it's being analyzed and it's being put up to somebody who has a lot of experience, and I have some trust, in the judgment of that particular person and how they're presenting this to me. The map is showing a whole lot of underlying things. So when I'm looking at it, and take the bait on your question, when I'm looking at a country where I know that there is a credible network, whether it's from various media sources, as you could find in Indonesia or in Mexico or in other places, that knows how to do this kind of stuff, or a credible network of citizen observers who have been very well trained, who are using, the best of technologies, not just SMS. They've got a mobile app that they're using for this or that. I mean, you can take this up into a lot of different, ratchet it up into a lot of different technologies. But the point is the credibility of the people who are making observations, who are transmitting those observations in an information form that we can use as data. Other people who are receiving it, testing the reliability of that, going back and looking at it, and then there's an analysis that takes place that allows them to say, what's going on? There's not very much manipulation in the process. Not many people are being disenfranchised over the course of the day. Not much vote buying is going on here. The count was accurate in this random representative sample of polling stations. And what's more is, when we add it up, what the Election Commission is saying corresponds to what we think is the right thing. I mean, couched with some training and judgment and how you make those conclusions. Just like when I'm watching election night here, I feel a lot more confident in that than when I feel that I turn to another channel and somebody's just giving me their personal opinion about what they see around the country. And there are domestic citizen election monitoring groups that do that just give you personal opinions. And there are others that are quite systematic and reliable. There are election commissions that make their data available, that are very well trained, that have very good systems and make their data immediately available. And people look at it and they come to trust. In countries where the political parties, opposing parties, are able to do the same thing, have their own independent opinions, and look at the election data, they're going to trust it a lot more too. And in countries where citizens don't really trust either the election commission or the parties, if there are credible citizen observers doing this sort of thing, the mix gives you some stability, takes volatility out of the circumstance. And in each of these, going back to the beginning, whether, as the keynote speaker said, you're looking at the election administration, or you're looking at the political competitors, or you're looking at the citizens, whether it's through civic groups or the media, these are the people, the elements that need help. And they need technical help. And I think those in this audience over the course of the afternoon and the next days together will come up with some really good ideas, some interesting solutions, and hopefully we'll see some innovations that are a consequence of our gathering. So thank you all very much.